This episode covers the topic of child abuse, and some may find this quite upsetting. This is the conclusion to the Moira Anderson story. We left episode 3 in February 1998, with Sandra having released her best-selling book, Where There Is Evil, after being let down by the justice system in regards to her father, Alexander Gartshore's crimes against members of her family and the likely murder of Moira Anderson. However, the year before, in 1997, a church elder in Scotland had been convicted of molesting 5 young girls and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Little did Sandra know at the time of her book being released that this would propel Moira Anderson's case back into the spotlight when this man was linked to her murder by his own family members following his death in April 1999. And then this man's own deathbed confession was revealed. Back in 1957, at the time of Moira Anderson's disappearance and likely murder, another man working at Baxter Buses in Coatbridge, with whom Alexander Gartshore was friendly, was a man called James Gallogly, who it was later revealed was also a friend and neighbour of mass murderer Fred West when he lived in Coatbridge. James Gallogly began working at Baxter Buses in 1956 and quickly befriended Alexander Gartshore, whereas other workers at Baxter Buses avoided Alexander Gartshore as, according to a former Baxter Buses worker, everyone knew Gartshore was a pervert who preyed on young girls. Going on to say in a Daily Mail article that no one wanted to be associated with him, but Gallogly became his best pal. However, the reason why it was likely Alexander Gartshore and James Gallogly became fast friends would not be discovered until August 1997, when church elder James Gallogly was found guilty of molesting 5 young girls, following being caught on CCTV interfering with a little girl. However, just like with Sandra's family, James Gallogly's family had long held suspicions that he had in some way been partly responsible for Moira Anderson's disappearance, with a family member revealing after James Gallogly's death in 1999 in an article in the Daily Record that, "We always believed in our hearts that James had something to do with that wee girl's murder. After he was jailed for sexually abusing 5 girls, we became even more convinced." Going on to say that they believed that both James Gallogly and Alexander Gartshore were involved in a paedophile ring in the late 1950s and early 1960s, along with Fred West before he moved to England. Following this revelation by James Gallogly's family, Sandra Brown revealed for the first time in a Daily Mail article that, "I do not think my father acted alone that night. I am sure now that someone helped him. I believe it could have been Gallogly, because they were as thick as thieves." While it was revealed by James Gallogly's family members after his death that they had had long-held suspicions about his involvement in Moira Anderson's disappearance, it appeared that Moira's sister Janet had voiced her own suspicions long before that, as she revealed in an article in the Daily Record that she had written to James Gallogly 3 times following him being found guilty of child sexual abuse and sent to prison, where she had begged him to admit what he had done to Moira decades before. Despite Janet never receiving any reply from James Gallogly, she said that he knew more than he was letting on. Both he and Gartshore were in cahoots. They were good friends, and I am convinced he was involved. She went on to express her utter disappointment that the police at the time of the initial investigation into Moira's disappearance did not deem it pertinent to question and interview both James Gallogly and Alexander Gartshore, saying that the police let us down badly. While James Gallogly's family may have had their suspicions about his involvement in Moira Anderson's disappearance until he was charged and found guilty of molesting 5 young girls in 1997, he hid this fact very well, dedicating his life to the church along with his wife of 40 years. And according to the Daily Mail article, he was a trusted church elder who would look after young children at Sunday school and take them on day trips. Since his conviction, his family have suffered immensely due to the mere association with him, with his brother, who was a minister in Coatbridge at the time, saying in the Daily Mail article that, "My sons cannot get jobs because of their surname, and he has brought this family down to the lowest." Despite James Gallogly being convicted of child sexual abuse, his brother still believes he is innocent of any wrongdoing in regard to Moira Anderson's disappearance, as he claims he had an alibi, saying that James Gallogly had spent the entire night with his fiancée and future wife, wedding planning. However, when James Gallogly's wife was found as she had fled her home following her husband's arrest, she said that the police never asked me to confirm his alibi, and I cannot remember whether he was with me that night or not. When Alexander Gartshaw was questioned surrounding these revelations, he denied ever being friends with James Galogly. Sadly, this new information led nowhere, and Moira Anderson's case again went cold. That was until 2003, when it was revealed that the police were keen to investigate a 26-page deathbed confession which related to Moira. Would this shed any further light on Moira Anderson's disappearance? Shortly before James Galogly died in 1999, he apparently made a lengthy confession to a fellow prisoner, Alexander Keel, who in turn had documented all of these details, as apparently James Galogly was too ill to write this confession himself. These details apparently included the area where Moira Anderson's body was, with Detective Chief Inspector Les Darling saying in an article in the BBC News on the 12th of October 2003 that, "We are more than interested in this new information and look forward to examining it." According to the same article, the apparent confession by James Galogly went on to say that on the day Moira had gone missing, she had been sedated and taken to the bus depot and had been abused by James Galogly, Alexander Gartshaw, and a third unknown man. Moira had then apparently been left, likely unconscious, overnight in a boxed area under one of the bus seats, only to be found dead the following day, with James Galogly apparently saying that, "We believe it was the cold that killed her, as it was very bitter that night." The confession went on to say that Moira's body had then been dumped in a local burn a few days later. As damning as this was, the confession went on to reveal even more. James Galogly had apparently told fellow prisoner Alexander Keel that back at the time of Moira Anderson's disappearance, there had been a paedophile ring working in the Coatbridge area, which apparently included not only James Galogly and Alexander Gartshaw, but also serial killer Fred West and Dunblane gunman Thomas Hamilton, as well as members of the Scottish Parliament, senior police officers and judges. It was also disclosed at the time that Alexander Gartshaw had been a member of the Freemasons when he lived in Coatbridge, with Sandra revealing in her book Where There Is Evil that the members of that particular lodge that Alexander Gartshaw was part of consisted of 90% policemen. When news of this apparent deathbed confession reached Moira's sister Janet in Australia, she broke down in tears, saying in an article in the BBC News that, "Now I just hope and pray to God they reopen the case, and maybe we can finally bring this to an end." But why had it taken almost 4 years after the deathbed confession had been made by James for police and Janet to be made aware of it? Well, according to Where There Is Evil, Alexander Keel had in fact contacted the Scottish Crown Office and made them aware that he had the confession and asked if they or Strathclyde police detectives would come and speak to him about the deathbed confession. However, the Crown Office refused to take this seriously and nobody ever followed this up. And so the existence of the deathbed confession was kept secret until Alexander Keel, who had taken the deathbed confession, was released in 2003 and he finally went public with it. However, only after asking newspapers for £20,000, which in today's money is £35,000 or $44,500 for the first 15 pages of the confession. Although when no payment was forthcoming, he did hand over the first 15 pages, with officers from Strathclyde Police receiving the full 26 pages. However, after the details, including those named as potentially being part of a paedophile ring, were thoroughly examined by senior police officers, the confession was discredited, and permission to re-interview Alexander Gartshaw was denied, as apparently no grounds for this had been discovered in the confession. Following this confession being discredited, a report was sent by Strathclyde Police to the Procurator Fiscal in 2004, which stated that Strathclyde Police had ruled that the deathbed confession would not be disclosed to the public, as it may prejudice any future prosecutions if there were to be any. While it appeared the exact details of the deathbed confession would not be disclosed, what was known was that Moira's sister Janet's hopes of finally finding justice for Moira were dashed yet again. Sandra Brown, though, was not prepared to allow this potentially crucial evidence and Moira Anderson's case to quietly fade away again, with her saying in a BBC article, "I believe Alexander Gartshaw was part of something a lot bigger," going on to say that she felt her father had always been protected by those from high up. Sandra had already fought long and hard against the Scottish justice system to try and get justice for Moira as well as her own family. She wasn't going to stop fighting now. And so in 2005, Sandra sent a request to the Scottish Information Commission to disclose the information in the deathbed confession. However, this request was turned down 5 times by Strathclyde Police. But Sandra continued to appeal these decisions, despite fearing this was a battle she would not win. And at the time of this recording, Strathclyde Police have continued to turn down Sandra's request to make the 26-page deathbed confession public. Although excerpts from the first 15 pages have been released in the Sunday Mail, the newspaper that Alexander Keogh handed the confession over to, and it's interesting reading. But experts who have read these details have also branded it as a cruel hoax. You can find some of the details from the document Confession, a Cruel Hoax, that you'll find a link to in the show notes. However, despite Strathclyde Police and experts discrediting the confession, a search was carried out in the area of the burn where the confession said Moira's body had been dumped after her death, but sadly nothing was found. But this wouldn't be the last search that was carried out, and there were yet more twists and turns to come in this case. While Sandra and Moira's sister Janet continued to battle to have Moira's case investigated again, investigated as a murder inquiry and not merely a missing person inquiry, to have searches for Moira's body carried out, and to have Alexander Gartshore be re-interviewed in connection with Moira's disappearance, Sandra also launched the Moira Anderson Foundation as a legacy to Moira and her family, which, according to moiraanderson.org, provides a place of safety and support for children and adults who have been affected by childhood sexual abuse. And in 2006, Sandra received an OBE for her services to child protection in Scotland. Sandra says in Where There Is Evil that her drive to seek justice for Moira came from a feeling of failing to protect Moira from her father, despite her being only 8 years old when Moira disappeared. 2006 then came around, and while Sandra didn't hear if another appeal to have the details of the confession made public would be granted, she instead heard some other news. Her father, Alexander Gartshore, was in hospital and was not expected to come out. But did Sandra want to see her father again before he died? She spoke to her brothers, who both decided they wouldn't go and see their father in hospital. But after careful consideration, Sandra felt she had to. She needed to find out if her father would finally admit to his part in Moira Anderson's disappearance and the location of her body on his deathbed. She needed to do this for Moira and her remaining family. And so on Friday the 24th of March 2006, Sandra and her husband made the trip to the Leeds hospital where her father now lay dying. According to Where There Is Evil, her father initially refused to see Sandra. However, after a word from his third wife, he agreed. With Alexander now alone in his room, with his wife having left to give Sandra and he privacy, Sandra made her way into his room, and her heart raced with shock. Not at how ill her father looked, as the nurse had warned her, but at how big and imposing he still seemed, sitting in his chair beside his bed with an oxygen tank attached, staring at her as she entered his room and sat on the remaining chair, close, but not too close to her father's. At this point, while Sandra did not ask her father's permission to record their conversation, she took from her bag a dictaphone, pressed record on it, and placed it openly on the windowsill, before facing her father and saying, according to Where There Is Evil, "Dad, you know why I'm here," to which he simply nodded. Sandra and her father quietly spoke about family, her children and grandchildren, the family he didn't know, and before long an hour had passed. The topic of family seemed to have settled Alexander, and so Sandra then produced Moira Anderson's photo to see what he said. He initially recoiled, before then taking it and looking at it for some time, before eventually turning to Sandra and saying, "You know, Sandra, that I never touched that little lass. I never even seen her. I seen her coming off my bus," before he broke off and began to cry. However, he quickly composed himself again and said to Sandra that I wasna involved. Before he then said of Moira, looking at her photo, "She's haunted me my whole life. She was bonny, too bonny for her own good," before ending by saying, "I regret everything to do with that kid." The nurse then came into the room, and it was time for Sandra to leave, telling her father before she went, "You won't see me again." Sandra left the hospital feeling lighter, feeling she had said what she needed to say to her father, but was deeply sorry that her father had not done the right thing and disclosed what had happened to Moira and where her body was, giving the much-needed closure to Moira's family. And her heart broke when Sandra telephoned Janet on her return home to tell her the news. Alexander Gartshore died 8 days later. Would this mark the end to any chance of Moira and her family receiving justice? The following year, 2007, was the 50th anniversary of Moira Anderson's disappearance, and on the 23rd of February, a special service to celebrate Moira's life took place at Airdrie Baptist Church, the very church where Moira had been christened, where Sandra said, according to an article in the BBC News, although Moira's time was all too short, her legacy is remarkable, with so many children, young people and families who suffered child sexual abuse being supported through the Moira Anderson Foundation. But that was not all 2007 brought. It brought the beginnings of yet another long fight for Sandra and Moira's family. Apparently, in 2005, at the same time a search had been carried out in the area of the burn where James Gallogly's deathbed confession had said Moira's body had been dumped, which sadly found no trace of Moira, a separate area had been searched using a radar survey, and that survey had, according to an article in the Scotsman in 2012, indicated there was a possibility of an unauthorised burial. The area being a family grave in the old Monkland Cemetery in Coatbridge, where it just so happened a friend of Alexander Gartshore's, a friend who had died around the very same time that Moira had disappeared, had been buried. This area was of interest as apparently Alexander Gartshore had said at the time of his friend's death and grave being dug and Moira's disappearance that his friend dying had done him a big favour, with it being thought that perhaps he had taken Moira's body from the burn and placed her in the family grave before his friend's coffin was then placed on top. However, despite this evidence and the radar survey apparently suggesting that it was possible Moira's remains could be in the grave, for whatever reason this information was not acted upon, and so yet again Sandra and Moira's family embarked on a long fight to have this grave exhumed and searched for Moira's remains, believing in their hearts that this was where Moira's body was. But they would have to wait to find out for sure, wait and fight for 5 long years. But before permission was given for the family grave to be searched and agreement sought by the family of the grave, something happened that left Moira's sister, 68-year-old Janet, shell-shocked. In May 2011, a new Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland, was appointed, and this turned out to be extremely good news for Moira's family and Sandra, as in July 2012, Lord Mulholland finally did what no previous Lord Advocate would do. He changed Moira Anderson's case from missing person to murder, and instructed the very newly set up Cold Case Review Unit to make Moira Anderson's case a priority. Moira's sister Janet was shocked but so pleased that after 55 years her sister's case was now being taken seriously and treated as a murder, saying in an article in the Scotsman in July 2012, "I am praying this is the last hurdle before we get some kind of closure and finally find out what happened to Moira." It was at this point that Sandra revealed that Moira's sister Janet would be petitioning the court, with Sandra's help, to seek permission to have the family grave where Sinclair Upton had been buried exhumed, where previously a radar survey had indicated there was a possibility of an unauthorised burial. And amazingly, Sandra and Moira's family didn't have a fight on their hands and didn't have to wait very long, as permission for this exhumation was granted on the 13th of December 2012, and the family of the grave, where at least 8 people were thought to have been buried, gave their permission for this to take place. And so Strathclyde police were instructed to undertake the exhumation, with the painstaking and sensitive exhumation beginning on the 8th of January 2013. Sandra was present for the exhumation and said in an article in the Daily Mail, "I truly believe this grave has secrets to give up. We owe it to Moira to open it." However, after a 2-day exhumation and search of the grave, sadly, Moira's remains were not discovered, and Moira's sister was said to be hugely disappointed. But hope did still remain, as Chief Inspector Kenny MacLeod said in a Daily Mail article, "Despite today's outcome, the case will remain open. Any further lines of inquiry will be fully investigated." Sandra too continued to show her unwavering determination to continue to seek justice for Moira, saying in the same article that, "My belief is that Moira is not far from us, but she remains concealed by extremely wicked people." Going on to say, "It's certainly not the end of the story. The Upton family could now let their family members rest in peace." As promised by detectives, Moira's case remained firmly open, and all evidence and lines of inquiry that had been investigated was reinvestigated by detectives, who also in March 2013 made a public appeal for anyone with any information to come forward, specifically those who had been employed at Baxter buses in any capacity during the late 50s, even if they had previously been in touch to give information. There was a slight setback, though, as due to Moira having disappeared over 56 years prior, 3 of the 4 witnesses who had given statements at the time of Moira's disappearance, saying that they had seen Moira on the day of her disappearance, near or on the same bus that Alexander Gartshore was driving, had since passed away. But Sandra believed that an even bigger opportunity to prosecute her father for Moira's murder had been missed. I mentioned in part 3 that Sandra had accompanied a newspaper reporter and photographer to her father's flat in Leeds, where once inside their conversation was taped, which while Alexander Gartshore didn't specifically confess to being involved in Moira's disappearance and murder, Sandra believed that he did state a number of facts that could have suggested his involvement, such as he had been driving the bus that picked up Moira that fateful day, and that he had gotten off the bus at the same time as her, with a relief driver having taken over from him, and that Moira had told him that she was going to Woolworths to get a birthday card for her mum, despite him firstly denying even knowing who she was, and then denying that she'd been on his bus that day. However, while Sandra and the reporter had handed over this recording to detectives at the time it had been recorded in 1993, the Crown Office had refused to take it any further, deeming that Alexander Gartshore, at 73 years old, was too old to prosecute, and that the case was now too old to go forward with. When asked about this, Sandra said in an article in the Daily Record in January 2013 that it was a lost opportunity. He should have been prosecuted, and if he had been, I'm sure he would have finally revealed what happened to Moira. She could have been found long ago, and her family could have laid her to rest with dignity. But instead, Alexander Gartshore had never even been questioned in connection with this recording, and he died in 2006 at the age of 85, taking any information he had about Moira with him. However, DCI Pat Campbell, the detective leading the reinvestigation of Moira's case, said in an article in the BBC News following the appeal that new information had been passed to the inquiry team as a result of the appeal, and that officers are currently assessing that information and following up any leads. Following this, it's presumed officers continued working on the investigation, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive, speaking to Baxter bus employees from the late 50s who came forward, and going over all the evidence and statements that had previously been collected, as things quietened down after the flurry of activity following the exhumation and appeal. That was until January 2014, when another shocking and unprecedented step was reported in newspapers. Alexander Gartshore was named by prosecutors as Moira Anderson's murderer. Well, sort of, but I'll come to that. So why now, after almost 57 years of Sandra and Moira's family fighting against the Scottish legal system, and Alexander Gartshore now having been dead for 8 years, why now? What had happened? Well, it appears fresh eyes looking at all of the old evidence, both from at the time of Moira's disappearance and the evidence presented to police by Sandra over the years, as well as more witnesses thankfully coming forward, 2 of which being extremely important. According to an article in the Daily Record in January 2014, one new witness came forward to say that Alexander Gartshore had exposed himself to her and Moira while they were at the local park in 1956, and that he had apparently called Moira by name, backing up what Sandra and Janet had thought all along, that despite Alexander initially having denied it, he knew exactly who Moira was when she stepped onto his bus that fateful Saturday in 1957. The second witness told the cold case detectives that they had seen a man dragging a young girl, fitting Moira's description, by the arms near a bus terminus in Coatbridge on the day Moira was reported missing, going as far as picking out Alexander Gartshore as the man who had been pulling the young girl by the arms when asked to go through a number of photos. Both new witnesses were said to have had credible reasons for not coming forward beforehand. So, these new witness statements, coupled with the other witness statements from back in 1957, as well as the evidence Sandra had produced, led to this turn of events. So, fantastic. Finally, Moira's murderer has been revealed. Well, not quite. as despite the announcement being welcomed by Lord Advocate Mulholland, he went on to explain that despite Alexander Gartshore being accused of being Moira's murderer, this didn't actually equate to him being found guilty, saying in a Daily Record article, "The trial process is the only way in which guilt or innocence can be determined. We are not saying that the suspect is guilty, only that there is sufficient credible and reliable evidence to indict him, and there would be a reasonable prospect of conviction had he still been alive." Going on to say that he hoped this brought the long-fought-for closure that Moira Anderson's family and Sandra so desperately needed. DCI Pat Campbell did go on to say in the same article that Moira's disappearance remains an unsolved case and would be subject to periodic reviews, going on to appeal again to anyone with any information that could help Moira's remains be recovered to please come forward. Searches have continued to be carried out over the years, following geographic reports, surveys and forensic soil science being carried out, with the last search being carried out in 2017, and new possible locations to search having been identified in 2022, based on information police have already received and any new evidence that is made available. But that vital piece of information that could lead to Moira's remains is still to be uncovered. But Sandra, having previously been so let down by the police and legal system, did say in an article in the Daily Mail in May 2015 that it's beyond the call of duty what the investigators are doing now. In 2017, on the 60th anniversary of Moira's disappearance, Janet, Moira's sister, travelled to Scotland from her now home in Australia to mark the occasion, saying in an article in The Sun in March 2017 that, "I pray each night that she's found, and I still have nightmares, although not so often now. All we want is closure." But this story still doesn't end there, as two more important witnesses are still to come forward with very interesting and credible information, with the first coming forward in February 2018, the 61st anniversary of Moira's disappearance. A woman, now in her late 70s and living in France, was pleased to finally be giving Cold Case Unit detectives her statement about an event in February 1957 that had disturbed her so much that it still caused her nightmares. While in her late teens, this woman was living with a couple, family friends, in a farmhouse on the edge of Coatbridge, and late on the evening on Saturday the 23rd of February 1957, the day Moira Anderson went missing, she had alighted from a bus in the centre of Coatbridge and had begun walking to the farmhouse, eventually turning off a main thoroughfare and taking a lonely, isolated farm track, which took her to the farmhouse. It was dark and a blizzard was coming down, with snow lying, so she was fighting her way along the track with her head down, when she began to see there were footprints in the wet ground, suggesting someone was walking ahead of her. While she was puzzling who could be out on the lonely track so late in the evening in such weather, she heard a scream that scared her so much that she ran the rest of the way to the farmhouse. Once safely in the warmth of the farmhouse, she inquired if anyone had been visiting the farm that evening that could explain the footprints and scream. But the couple said no one had visited and dismissed her concerns when she wondered out loud if they should inform the police. As she was a guest, she complied, but had wondered at the time and over the years why the couple had been so reluctant to take her seriously and involve the police. The second witness who came forward to give a statement in March 2021 was someone much closer to Sandra, and the revelation left her feeling shocked and disappointed that not only had they not come forward sooner with the information, but also disappointed that secrets still appeared to exist within her own family, despite everything she had been through. Apparently, Alexander Gartshore's father, Sani, had disclosed to his brother-in-law around the time of Moira's disappearance that his son, Alexander, had admitted to him that he'd murdered Moira. In turn, Sani's brother-in-law had disclosed the same information to his son, Jim, Alexander Gartshore's cousin, in 1971. With Jim saying in an article in the Daily Record in March 2021 that Sani, Alexander's father, had taken this secret to the grave instead of informing the police because of what it would have done to his wife, Alexander's mother. Jim went on to say that he didn't disclose this information until 2021, the 64th anniversary of Moira's disappearance, because I felt it wasn't my secret to share, and I don't know where her body was hidden, so to some extent I didn't feel I could do much to help. But as you get older and start to think of your own mortality, I thought I should share what I knew. Continuing by saying that my dad would never have shared this if it wasn't true. When asked her thoughts on this new revelation, Sandra told the Daily Record newspaper that she had been shocked to learn this, going on to say that, "I knew my grandfather suspected my father and challenged him when no one else had, but I never knew he got a confession from him. I'm sad that he didn't use that information to make sure Moira and her family got justice." At this time, former lead investigator and now Assistant Police Constable Pat Campbell said, "This continues as a live investigation, and I appeal to the public for information. It could be vital to our inquiries." Janet summed it all up in the same article in 2021 when she said, "After 64 years, it is still the feeling of not knowing that causes so much pain." And sadly, even in 2024, the pain for Janet of not knowing what happened to Moira and where her remains are continues. If you have been affected by the topic covered in these episodes, if you're in Scotland, as after an initial phone call, appointments are face-to-face, then you can contact the Moira Anderson Foundation at moiraanderson.org, which is dedicated to supporting children and adults who have been affected by childhood sexual abuse, or get support from organisers in your area or country. As the Moira Anderson Foundation is a charity, if you would like to support it, then you can give a donation by visiting the website. Now it's time for the first
Dawn's Digest
of the year. I apologise again for the delay in releasing part 4 of the Moira Anderson case, but sometimes life gets in the way, and sometimes my time and attention is needed elsewhere to support others. However, things have settled down again, which is why I was able to write and release this episode. For the rest of February, while I get some more episodes written, I'm going to be releasing the collaboration episodes I recorded with Naomi Channel last year regarding Luke Mitchell and Jodie Jones, as well as a Darkcast Network ethics discussion. Then, starting from the 5th of March, I plan to release 3 episodes each month, so don't forget to subscribe if you're not already, so you don't miss the extra episodes. To help to deliver this great extra content, I will be speaking with other podcasters, where we will tell you a story about a murder that took place out with Scotland, either a Scottish victim or Scottish murderer, a sort of home and away season if you like. Also in 2024, our production company, Clurenton, is planning on releasing at least 2 new podcasts, one focusing on delving into the policing community around the world, and the other speaking with people who have inspiring stories to share. And Scottish Digest will also be back for Season 2, where I'll be chatting with people who will be sharing their love of different places and areas in Scotland with me, hopefully offering some inspiration for your next trip. Make sure you don't miss out on any of these exciting new developments by following Clurenton on social media. It's at Clurenton on X, formerly known as Twitter and Instagram, and we're also on LinkedIn. And watch out also on Clurenton for some exciting giveaways in the near future. So that's what's coming up with our podcasts in 2024. But there's even more. We're also going to be at CrimeCon in Glasgow on the 27th of April 2024 and in London on the 21st and 22nd of September 2024, and it would be great to meet as many of you as possible. CrimeCon UK is the world's leading true crime event, which is partnered by True Crime, the expert-led true crime TV channel. Attending a CrimeCon event is a fantastic and fascinating experience, with a variety of speakers covering a wide range of topics. There truly is something for everyone. This year, there are a wide range of tickets you can purchase, but don't forget to quote Scottish at the checkout for your special 10% discount. We hope to see you later this year in Glasgow and London.